Assalamualaikum and good day, everyone. Welcome to the OTC Asia live session. My name is Juhaidi Jaafar from Malaysia Petroleum Management, Petronas, and I will be the moderator for today's University R&D showcase. For this session, I would like to welcome Mr. Laurie Swiffen-Stiles from the University of Nottingham. Yes, the one in the UK. So it's early morning for him over there. He will present on a topic of the capture value problem for offshore wind and a possible solution based on air compression. A bit into the topic for discussion here. This is definitely relevant to the people working in energy business. While the renewables such as wind and solar is very much established in the UK, Europe, and America, the other areas such as most part of Asia Pacific is only now taking just the first few steps towards balancing the energy utilization. It also includes fossil fuel, hydroelectric, and biomass. Laurie here will go a few steps further by evaluating the concern of capture value for offshore wind, how to find the best way to keep this particular renewable energy commercially competitive. Okay, after his presentation, there will be some question and answer sessions, and I really encourage for all the participants to pay attention and ask questions that could actually be used to enhance further this study and for our better understanding. So without further delays, I would like to invite Laurie to the stage to begin his presentation. All the best. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Laurie Swiffen-Stiles. I am a postgraduate research student with the University of Nottingham, and today I would like to discuss two challenges for offshore wind and one possible solution based on air compression. I will begin by identifying these two challenges, which many of you may have heard one or both of before. I will discuss generation integrated energy storage in relation to mid-grid or standalone storage. I'll give an overview of the system we're talking about, which is WIDASIS. I will give the results of a preliminary simulation. I will then discuss how this system addresses the capture value problem, which is one of the challenges, and then the future work. Now, the first problem, the most commonly discussed problem with renewables, is that of flexibility. Unlike fossil fuels, which can be turned up and down as needed, the renewable output cannot be adjusted. It can be turned down, it can be curtailed, but this is essentially a waste of electricity. And with a small penetration of renewables, this isn't really a problem. Flexible fossil fuels can be powered up or down, they can meet demand. However, as the penetration of renewables into an energy grid increases, we're going to start seeing energy wasted. And when you look at the peak output of wind rather than the average output, this will start happening sooner than simple calculations might initially predict. While there are several possible solutions to this problem of inflexibility with renewables, the one we're going to discuss today, and possibly the most commonly discussed one, is energy storage. So while inflexibility is perhaps the largest problem facing offshore renewables in the future, there is also the problem of capture value. Now, capture value is a measure of how effectively a wind turbine can achieve its average electricity price over a time period. And with low or little penetration of wind into any grid, this capture value is essentially 1, because the wind availability is not affecting the electricity price. However, with high penetrations of wind, this capture value is set to go far below 1, and this is where many countries are headed as wind penetrates further into their grids, especially places like the UK. Now, of course, a lower capture value means higher risk and lower profits for a conventional wind farm operator, as times of high wind are going to be increasingly associated with times of low electricity price. And this could result in lower wind investment in the future. As I previously mentioned, one of the core solutions to the problem of inflexibility with renewables is energy storage. Predictions for high penetrations of renewables in future energy grids imply that very large quantities of this energy storage are going to be required. Some predictions imply over 300 terawatt hours in Europe, for example. To date, much of the research into energy storage has been focused on mid-grid or standalone storage. This means that electricity is generated by some renewable source before being converted into some storable form, like chemical energy or compressed air, for example, and then converted back into electricity as required. However, another set of solutions can be described as Generation Integrated Energy Storage, or GIES. GIES systems convert this initial energy into its storable form before it's ever used to generate electricity. Now, a simple example of this is natural hydropower, where river water is stored in the form of potential energy in a big reservoir, and then it's used to generate electricity in turbines. The figure on this slide shows the comparative energy transformations of a mid-grid store compared to a GIS store. Note that for energy that passes through storage, the energy transformations are reduced in a GIS system. I make this point more than once in this presentation, but it should be noted that co-located standalone energy stores are not necessarily GIS systems. There are definite benefits to wind turbines utilizing local energy storage, but such systems still generate electricity and then convert it into a storable form. The figure on this slide shows the potential benefits of a GIS system. Due to the reduced number of energy transformations for any energy that has had to pass through storage, Generation Integrated Energy Storage can perform significantly better than mid-grid counterparts if enough total energy consumed had to pass through storage. Of course, the other side of this coin is that if you're passing very little energy through storage, the conventional turbine is likely to perform better overall, as it likely has a slightly higher pure transmission efficiency, and very little of that energy is actually passing through the relatively low efficiency storage. Currently, of course, we're looking at the lower end of this graph with current energy grids, but we can expect that to change, and very soon, if we're looking to greatly increase renewable penetration into the grid. Now, as the title of this presentation might suggest, our project utilizes air compression, and I like to use two terms with regards to air compression, and these are wind-powered and wind-driven. Wind-powered compressors are those that utilize the electricity generated by conventional wind turbines to compress air, whereas wind-driven compressors are powered directly by the rotation of the shaft of the wind turbine itself. Wind-driven air compression can therefore be used as part of a generation integrated energy storage system as long as that compressed air is stored before being expanded to generate electricity. And now for an overview of the system itself, which we have named WIDASIS, standing for Wind-Driven Air Compression and Isobaric Storage. WIDASIS can provide flexibility to floating offshore wind turbines in the form of underwater compressed air energy storage, as well as some thermal energy storage. Energy can be stored when wind availability is high, but electricity price is low, and then released when electricity price is high, but there is little or no wind. The system utilizes the hydrostatic pressure available in deep water to store this compressed air in cheap, flexible energy bags. WIDASIS has been designed to be direct drive. The gearbox is replaced with a high-efficiency, slow-speed compressor, and the generator is moved onto the floating platform itself. The inlet air is first compressed to some intermediate pressure by an electrically driven compressor. This is done to account for the large intake swept volumes required by a direct drive machine, which I will discuss in more detail on the next slide. The wind-driven compressor could be designed to be either isothermal or adiabatic. That's the main compressor inside the wind turbine. In the case of an isothermal compressor, the packed gravel bed thermal storage wouldn't be necessary, but we found it to be a fairly cheap form of storage anyway. We have investigated both configurations and we'll discuss that a little later in the presentation in the results. Using a direct drive system removes the need for a gearbox, which is a source of considerable cost and reliability concern for many wind farm operators. The downside of direct drive air compression, however, is that the volume of air you need to absorb into a compressor for every rotation of the wind turbine is very large. This is called the intake swept volume, and it can be calculated with these two equations. Suffice it to say, if you're trying to compress from ambient pressure, the compressor size quickly becomes unmanageable. It's certainly too large to fit within the nacelle of a wind turbine. Now, there are several solutions to the problem of intake swept volume, but the solution chosen for the Widasis system is to increase the inlet pressure of the air being compressed by performing some prior compression with a smaller electrically driven compressor. Of course, if this smaller compressor is powered by the grid, and we're assuming that it is for the time being, then Widasis is only partially a GIS system, as some electricity is being converted into a storable form of energy before being converted back into electricity. However, we'll see this in results later on, it is preferable to design the system such that this electrical compressor is only a small fraction of the overall system power, just enough to feed the wind-driven compressor with medium pressure air. There is also a benefit to this solution with regards to the capture value problem, and I'll discuss that in a little bit towards the end of the presentation. In order to get some sense of whether Widasis could be an economically viable system, we've simulated a number of iterations of the system over a year of real wind and electricity price data. We've used a price matching algorithm to optimize store operation that assumes perfect foreknowledge, but algorithms can be found that achieve similar results without this assumption. We've considered both isothermal and adiabatic wind-driven compressors because, of course, there are potential benefits to both from a design perspective. The electrical compressor itself, the first stage of compression, is isothermal in all cases. Now, for clarity, if some of you don't fully understand what isothermal and adiabatic means, isothermal means that there is no temperature change, the air doesn't heat up, and adiabatic means that there is no heat transfer. The air does heat up, and none of that heat is lost or removed during compression. We created iterations of the system by setting a reference wind turbine, a Vestas 8 megawatt wind turbine, and varying the inlet swept volume and store size of the system. This resulted in different total system powers, as the electrical compressor changed in size, but our main metric, which was the return on investment, is insensitive to this, regardless. It is interesting to see how varying the swept volume, which is essentially the same as varying the allowable inlet pressure of the wind-driven compressor, changes the ratio of pressures in the two compressors. As I've previously mentioned, it is preferable to reduce the power of the electrical compressor, and this can be done by increasing the swept volume of the wind-driven compressor. The system that utilizes an adiabatic wind-driven compressor can achieve much higher power ratios between wind-driven compressor and electrical compressor, which makes sense, of course, as extra work is done into heating the air. The graph on the right shows the simulated income, expenditure from running the compressor, and profit of one iteration of the system as swept volume is varied. You can see that increasing the relative power of the wind-driven compressor significantly reduces the money you need to spend running the electrical compressor, and therefore improves profits. The expenditure is even more severe for the isothermal case, where the ratio of pressures and powers is less favourable. Generally speaking, we found that the adiabatic case is significantly stronger than the isothermal one, especially as the thermal storage is not a significantly more expensive way to store this energy. Now, these two figures show the 1-year return on investment values for the system as swept volume and store size vary. Again, designing for high swept volumes is clearly good for the system. It's interesting to note that there is an optimal store size, around 15 to 20 hours of output capacity. This is probably due to the additional compressor machinery giving little benefit of flexibility at low store sizes and storage costs dominating at larger store sizes. You don't see this optimum in the simulations we performed for wind with standalone stores, as there's no initial extra cost of machinery compared with a conventional turbine when there's no energy store. With 10 to 12% return on investment found at optimal store sizes of 15 to 20 hours, it's useful to compare the Widasis system with wind plus standalone storage. Here we've performed the same simulation for lithium-ion battery storage and compressed air energy storage. As I mentioned previously, there's no optimum here, simply a declining return on investment as store costs increase, and the additional flexibility provided does not make up for it. At 15 to 20 hours, Widasis is competitive with conventional case storage, and seems to perform significantly better than the relatively expensive lithium-ion option. Of course, in the current energy grid, you'll get more bang for your buck by simply using a wind turbine with no storage. Storage is expensive, and offshore wind is getting cheaper by the minute. However, this will change as wind penetrates further into the energy grid and the capture value of wind power reduces. Integrating energy storage with wind in some form will become increasingly appealing to the operators of new wind farms. This leads us nicely to how Widasis itself addresses the capture value problem, and could do so more effectively than most wind energy storage solutions. Of course, any local energy storage is providing some flexibility and allowing operators to sell this energy at a more favourable price. Widasis does this too. However, Widasis also draws electricity from the grid, and it does so at times when wind is high, as it's needed to feed the compressor. Given that times of high wind will increasingly be associated with times of low electricity price, the cost of running this compressor is expected to reduce. But more than this, by providing negative supply, i.e. demand, during times of high wind, Widasis could provide a significant balancing service to the capture value problem, not only for itself, but also for any system in which it plays a significant enough role. So, with all that in mind, what work needs to be done to develop this system further? Well, firstly, I think more costing and exegetic analysis needs to be done. Where are the biggest areas of risk for the system? Are we going to be blindsided by unexpected costs, or find ways to significantly reduce the capital and operating costs of the system? There's also investigation work to be done on two interesting ideas. The first is the potential for running the first stage of compression with renewables, be it solar, wave, or something else. This would turn Widasis into a full GIES system and reduce its impact on the capture value, but would also reduce operating expenditure. There's also the potential for a medium pressure air store between the two compressors. This may be required if the first stage of compression were to be powered by something inflexible like solar. It would mean that we could run the electrical compressor more cheaply, but the medium pressure store would likely be more expensive per unit capacity than the high pressure store, so it's a toss-up. Finally, I believe there is a case to be made for a small-scale demonstrator, especially one that draws from the grid using a free market contract and demonstrates the underwater compressed air energy storage technology. With the initial exploratory work done, Widasis seems like it has some considerable potential as both a flexible generator and capture value balancer. Thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear any questions or thoughts that you may have on the Widasis system. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Laurie, for the excellent presentation. Hopefully, we all understand better of the situation, and hope the audience are also ready with some questions for you. Hopefully, easy questions first. Okay, we have a few questions here, and how about we start with something to warm things up? Okay, the first question here is, what's the relative cost of generating electricity from wind and the competitors?
Well, I can only really speak for the UK here, but I think it speaks to the maturity of the technology, even if the market in some countries, in some parts of Asia, is less mature than it is in the UK with renewables. But in the UK, offshore wind is an extremely cheap form of generation, along with other inflexible renewable generators. In the latest contracts for difference bids, which is how the UK auctions off wind power, the strike prices have been around £40 British pounds per megawatt hour. Now, this is comparable with other renewable generators and much cheaper than alternative forms of generation. So the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has estimated that the levelized cost of energy for offshore wind is around £57 per megawatt hour, and the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, is what the government uses to set as a maximum strike price for their auctions. And this is £57 compared with 46 for onshore and 44 for large-scale solar. Now, compared with closed-cycle gas turbines, for example, that's around £85 per megawatt hour. And Hinkley Point C, which is an upcoming nuclear plant in the UK, is going to cost the UK government £92.50 per megawatt hour, and that's in 2012 prices. So you can see how renewables are considerably cheaper than the alternatives. Now, currently, offshore wind is more expensive than onshore wind by a small fraction, but there is much more remaining available offshore resource in the UK than there is onshore resource. And furthermore, by 2040, Bayes predicts that the levelized cost of energy for offshore wind will be lower than onshore wind as there's more investment. So I think renewables are becoming, in the UK at least, by far the cheapest form of new generation.
Okay, thank you, Laurie, on that. So we heard about the cost comparison and how actually wind energy is being, I would say, making more established in the UK and Europe area. Okay, let's see for more questions here. I have one more here. You mentioned about the bigger penetration of renewable energies here. Who and what are the competitors to wind energy here? Is there room for collaborations to ensure that the demand is more stabilized so that not one area is losing out the others?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to note is that generation, particularly renewable generation, as I've mentioned, is going to become very cheap per megawatt hour generated. And I think that in a future primarily renewably powered grid, that energy storage is going to become the dominant cost. Now, energy storage is already quite a lot more expensive than energy generation. We just don't need much of it at the moment because we're using fossil fuels as flexible generators to make up for this inflexibility of renewables. Now, with that in mind, there's definitely an optimization to be had to minimize this energy storage requirement by mixing different inflexible generators together. The two main inflexible generators are solar and wind, of course, and I'm going to use the UK as an example here, but this is true for every country. But because solar and wind both have variations on a yearly cycle, you can mix these two generators together, and you can kind of minimize seasonal variation. So in the UK, we use a lot more power for heating than cooling at the moment. That may change with climate change in the future, but at the moment we're using a lot more power in the winter. And solar has a much higher average power output in the summer, upwards of a factor of about 10, whereas wind has a higher average output in the winter by a factor of between 2 and 3. So in the UK, we're likely to need more wind than we are solar because we need more energy in the winter. And perhaps a 75%, 25% mix of wind to solar is best to most effectively minimize the energy storage requirement. And there's clearly still room for solar generation in that case, even in the UK. And actually, for many hot countries, this whole situation is flipped around. You're going to need much more power for cooling than you do for heating. And so you need a higher mix of solar to wind. And I also believe that there's room for flexible low carbon generators like biomass or fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. And I think both have some challenges in terms of cost and resource management, but using at least some flexible generation like this will probably reduce energy storage requirements and possibly overall cost. So yes, the main low carbon competitors definitely have a place in any future energy grid. I think there's room for a good mix of healthy competition.
All right, thank you on that. That would be useful for the areas or countries that are going to have a more mix of energy sources. All right. Okay, one more questions here. The audience out there, please send more questions so that it will actually improve the study that Laurie is doing, and also for our understanding here. Okay, this one more here, on the WIDESIS here, you mentioned about the deep water storage. What's the depth proposed when you talk about the deep water here? And has this concept been implemented or tested on site?
Okay, so generally speaking, 10 meters of water depth relates to 1 bar of hydrostatic pressure. And I didn't mention it in the presentation, but we had assumed an upper pressure of 200 bar. So that's 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers of water depth. Now, in the UK, we have a continental shelf around us, which is relatively shallow water, but we are moving further and further afield in the UK for offshore wind, and we will be moving off this shelf. And for many countries around the world, this kind of water depth is much more readily accessible near the coastline. And 2,000 meters is not a set number, nor is it specifically optimized. It was simply a good mix of realistic water depth and high storage pressure for us. You could go deeper, which would generally make compressed air store cheaper, and you could go shallower if you can't access that kind of water depth. Our research group has done some experimentation with these underwater energy bags in shallower water in lakes, and we've had very positive results. Hopefully, we can do further practical work with this underwater compressed air energy storage, and hopefully we can combine it with wind-driven air compression in the future.
All right, thank you on that one also. Okay, we have a few more minutes for Q&A, and I think we have a few more questions that we can address here. Okay, I'll go on with this one. With the increasingly, okay, this is quite relevant maybe as current affairs that we can see. With the increasingly uncertain weather situation, and not to mention about the world affair that is disrupting the energy supply and demand, how do you expect this information to affect future energy generation and storage requirements? You're talking about the storage that could be taking up more cost for the future, right?
Yeah. So I actually think both of these phenomena strengthen the case for a grid largely powered by renewables, or at least local generation for any country. And in a renewable powered grid, backing this up with energy storage. And in particular, I think it strengthens the case for generation integrated energy storage, like wind integrated storage, like the system that I've described here. And increasing weather uncertainty is likely to lead to a larger total energy storage capacity requirement, because the larger variability is going to mean that we need more storage to make up for this. But with wind or solar integrated energy storage, the increased variability is essentially nullified for the grid. The grid sees much less of this variability because the variability is accounted for during generation and stored at local sites. An increased proportion of consumed energy through storage, which is going to happen with higher wind variability, is also likely to lead to generation integration energy storage dominant from an economic perspective compared to standalone. So I actually think as wind and solar, well, specifically wind, gets much more variable, as we expect in the future with weather patterns, we're likely to need generation integrated energy storage if we want to push in flexible renewables. And with regards to the current geopolitical situation, well, now more than ever, energy security is of a huge importance. And I think the general public is becoming more aware of this and really beginning to understand how significantly geopolitics can affect fuel prices and availability. And I think energy self-reliance, where possible, is an excellent solution to this. So one major advantage of renewables is that in the long run, they don't need fuel compared to fossil fuels. So I think they come with their own challenges, but I think they have significant energy storage benefits as well.
All right, thank you, Laurie. I think based on all the questions just now, it strengthens the need or the requirement for renewable energies to be further invested in or further pursued in all over the places. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. I think we are done with the Q&A now. We have enough time already. Thank you everyone for joining today's session and for interacting with us. It has been such a pleasure to moderate this session and to learn more about the renewable energy, especially offshore wind, which is quite established in certain areas. The questions and discussion points posted will be available for Laurie to further enhance his research. And further, plenty of information for us to digest as well and be used for our own studies and evaluation in this area. Hope the audience will find some benefit from this discussion and have a better view on the business of renewables. Last but not least, all the best to Laurie. Thank you from me, Juhaidi Jaafar. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhaidi, and thank you, OTC.